Tonight we're going to discuss social and gender structures in classical China. Quick reminder on timing of classical China. We talked about the Shang dynasty, which was during the River Valley civilization period, and classical China begins with the Zhou dynasty, which ruled for almost 1,000 years but had decentralized control, or not very strong control. Then came the Qin dynasty, which was ruled by Shi Huangdi for only 19 years. Remember, he used a system that was very strict called legalism. And then finally, the Han dynasty is our last dynasty in classical China. And the strongest emperor in the Han dynasty is Wu Di. And the Han dynasty ruled for almost 400 years. So our focus tonight is social structures. Remember that a political structure has to do with the government, any sort of development in the government or characteristic. A social structure has to do with class or hierarchical systems. Remember that a hierarchy is a structure that dictates who is important and has the most power and who is less important and has the least power. Social structures are often based upon gender and economic success, meaning that men usually have more power, and those people who are more successful in their jobs or have jobs that are more valued by society have more power because they have more money. Gender structures are part of social structures, and the gender structure describes the relationship between men and women in a given society. This relationship is typically unequal, with men having more power and women having less power. Gender structures are enforced through the social institutions in a civilization. Social institutions aren't things that are necessarily seen by the eyes. They can be social norms, such as what's acceptable for a woman to do or acceptable for a man to do, but they can include the church, schools, governments, and other sorts of institutions where people gather together. You can see from the chart below that there is a range of different kinds of gender structures and how they're controlled. So for example, the family structure is not very formalized. There's no code of law that says that women have to raise the children and that men should be the ones that earn the money. However, it doesn't mean that it's not strict in a society. There are gender structures in the family, as in what's expected of the man in the house and what's expected of the woman in the house. Who gets to make the decisions, who controls the money, who's in charge of the children, etc. As far as economic opportunities go, this just talks about job differences between men and women. For example, can you think of any jobs that you would expect men to have instead of women? Or any jobs that you would expect women to have? So when we start talking about social structures in classical China specifically, we'll start with the Zhou dynasty since it was the first one. And during the Zhou, there was decentralized control, which you remember from your vocabulary means that the emperor did not have strict control over the entire empire. Rather, the emperor relied on alliances or, understandings with regional noblemen, with vassals and princes. Okay? They relied on feudalism, which you can see the social structure at the right. The lowest class only responded and dealt with the landowning nobles who owned the land they lived on. Those landowning nobles responded to the local princes. The local princes were the ones who responded to the emperor. It was very rare that a peasant would ever meet or interact with the emperor. In the Zhou social framework, at the top you have the emperor. That's for the entire empire, but if you're looking at kind of an individual region, the regional noble would be at the top. Then you have the landowning nobles who answer to the regional nobles, and that's about 2% of the population. Below them is the peasantry who live on the land that the nobles own. And at the very bottom are the unskilled laborers, meaning they don't have a specific skill, but rather they provide muscle and they're the workhorses for the population. The Zhou ruled for almost 1,000 years, but did not maintain centralized power throughout their rule. This means that they were frequently challenged by outside invaders and by other powerful families that tried to take over. So as the Zhou began to falter, there was an effort to codify, which you know from your vocab means to create a system of laws that are universal to the entire empire. And this effort was in order to explain and describe Chinese culture at large, to create better unity that people would feel rather than identifying with their particular region, they would identify as a Chinese person, part of the Zhou dynasty. During this period, the most influential philosopher that helped with these efforts was Confucius. And he lived in the 6th century BC and the early 5th century BC. So this means the 500s BC. And Confucius was a philosopher, so his job was to write. He wasn't a political leader, but he wrote ideas that he had for the emperor about how to maintain strong control, what a great leader needed to maintain control. And so he wrote statements about political ethics, and these were called the Analects. And they served as a foundation for China's distinctive philosophical heritage. Confucianism, Confucius's ideas, will last until present-day China, so they're very powerful. And his ideas not only impacted politics, they also said how one should be in society. So they gave people an idea of how to act socially. And his main focus was 5 major relationships. So he said, in your life, every single person has 5 relationships. And if they can maintain these 5 relationships, society will be orderly. These 5 relationships don't matter whether you're upper class or lower class, they apply to everyone. So he made the social responsibility universal for all social classes. However, at the time, Confucius's ideas didn't catch on because they didn't fit in with the Zhou dynasty. But we'll see that they do catch on during the Han dynasty. So the 5 relationships of Confucianism include ruler to subject, so the subject and the ruler, parent and child, husband and wife, older brother and younger brother, and friend and friend. So he said every person in society has these 5 relationships that they need to maintain. And when everyone does their duty and their social responsibility in these relationships, the civilization will be orderly and well controlled. And this was a good thing. All 4 of these 5 relationships are unequal. There's a hierarchy. So the ruler has more power than the subject, a parent has more power than their child, the husband has more power than his wife, and the older brother has more power than the younger brother. The only relationship that was often equal was friend and friend. So it's important to remember that Confucianism is not a religion. It's not like Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism where there are gods or a god, and there's no, book of religion and belief. Instead, Confucianism is a social belief. It decides how people should act in society. And it's also a political belief. It tells rulers how to act. And as a social belief, it said if everyone fulfills their role in their 5 relationships and behaves correctly, that there will be order and stability in the society. Confucianism also stressed filial piety, which means respect for the parents. The parents have the last say. It was Confucianism who created the golden rule. You do unto others as you wish done to yourself. So treat others as you would like to be treated. Confucianism told rulers they must be virtuous, they must be honest, they have to lead by example. And Confucianism really stressed service, to serve the state, the government, to be in the military or try to be a government official. As far as gender, Confucianism said women were secondary to men, but that children always had to respect both of their parents, so their mothers as well as their fathers. The image you see on the slide are the Analects. It's a copy of what Confucius wrote. Do you remember what language this was written in? Think back to yesterday. The other social belief from the time is called legalism. And remember, legalism is also not a religion, but a social belief. And legalism came about around the same time as Confucianism and Taoism in this era of disorder during the Zhou dynasty. And legalism was a little bit different than Confucianism in that it didn't trust human nature. It said, we're born evil. The children, if they aren't taught discipline, are liable to do anything. And adults, when they want something, they're willing to murder for it. And so you need strict laws and harsh punishments to keep people under control. And legalism highly valued the military since it's necessary to keep people in line. And legalism was adopted by Shi Huangdi, who was the leader of the Qin dynasty. So with these strict laws and harsh punishments, think about how people might have reacted. Not very well, right? They resented these strict laws and there was a backlash, which is why the Qin dynasty only lasted 19 years. Because when Shi Huangdi died, the people killed his son, so his son was not able to take over control. However, legalism did mean that a lot was able to get done. Shi Huangdi was able to start building the Great Wall of China, and invest in a lot of new building projects because he had great control over his people. So I keep saying these philosophies are not religion. So I'm sure you're wondering, what was the religion? It was called Taoism. And you'll sometimes see it written with a D, and sometimes you'll see it written with a T, and that's because we've translated Taoism from Mandarin, which doesn't use the English alphabet. And so the sound is Tao, so it can be written either way. That's why you'll see both ways in your reading. And the Tao means the way of nature. It's the way of the universe. So they believed in, a flow to things. And it was founded by Lao Tzu around the same time as Confucianism and legalism in the 500s BC. And the philosophy was really that this flow to things are much like water, that it continues flowing. It is unstoppable if you think of a river, but it is flexible. You can divert a river, you can control water. Another common analogy is if you think of a pottery wheel. It spins and you need to mold the clay, and when you touch the clay, it is going to mold and change, but you can control it. So Lao Tzu's philosophy would be to yield, but be like water, be persistent. And Taoism promotes scientific progress. There were many great astronomers during this period and many great chemists. And it coexists peacefully with Confucianism and other social beliefs. So Taoism existed at the same time as legalism and Confucianism. And this makes China a very unique place. You'll see in the middle a symbol that you might be familiar with. It's the yin-yang symbol, and it symbolizes balance, and that's what Taoism believes in, that for every evil there is good, for night there is day, and that the universe is in balance, and this is how it... All right, it's Han Fusion time. So Shi Huangdi practiced legalism, that's under the chin, and that was that strict system with harsh punishments. And so when Shi Huangdi died, there was a bloody peasant uprising. And the Han Empire was established, actually, by peasants. And the Han Empire learned from the overly strict rule of Shi Huangdi under legalism, and they saw how under the Zhou dynasty, there wasn't a social philosophy or political philosophy, and things were kind of disorderly and there wasn't strong control. And so the Han dynasty really liked that element of control, so they blended ideas of Confucianism and legalism. What the Han dynasty is most noted for is establishing or starting the civil service exam. And the civil service exam said that to be in the government and telling people what to do, you should be educated. I know this is a revolutionary idea, rather than just being friends of the emperor. So they created this exam based on Confucius ideas and Chinese literature, and people had to take this exam in order to be in the government. So it provided assurance that anyone who was in the government was educated and deserved to be there. In the Han gender structure, as far as the family structure went, male children were superior to the female children, and there was a difference or a preference toward patriarchal power, which you remember patriarchal means father's in charge. But women could sometimes gain power through the work of their sons or son-in-laws. So they could receive credit or be acknowledged for the accomplishments that their sons made. And there were strict primogeniture rules. And primogeniture means that the first son gets everything, no matter what. So you'd have to be the oldest in order to have an inheritance. Also, the only thing women were honored for is for bearing the next generation of male heirs, right? The next generation of males they did receive recognition for. As far as economic opportunities, women could work in textiles, which mean cloth or fabrics. You should write that down in your notes. So when you write textiles, explain that textiles are cloths or fabrics. And they could, sew and weave by the end of the Han dynasty. And if they made money, they were also expected, though, to pay taxes. And this was an exception, not the norm. So only, lower class women would do work, and they had to be very skilled. As far as schooling went, under Confucian rule, education was open to a large percentage of women, but only upper class women. And it wasn't school to, learn reading and writing and academics. Instead, it was to learn proper behaviors, so etiquette, right? How to be a proper woman. The legal codes, according to Han and Tao teaching, emphasized the yin and the yang. So for every man, there is a woman. The woman is a necessary balance. By late Han Dynasty, this was formalized or put into writing with an emphasis on the male being the yang, the powerful, the masculine, the ones in charge, the rulers. The yin being the lower, more timid, quiet, elegant, feminine balance. So just to reiterate, the classical Chinese social structure, the family was the foundation of society. So if you dishonored your family, you were more or less shamed and kicked out of society. So the family is really what kept people in line because they had ancestor worship and valued the opinion of their ancestors. Hierarchy and social order is valued at every level. So think of the Confucian 5 relationships. In every relationship, there's a hierarchy, there's a social order. Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism blend to make China unique in its approach to social hierarchy because they have civil service exams and the way women kind of fit in. And it's patriarchal, but there's still chances for women to gain power. You do not need to do the main idea practice and supporting detail for practice for homework, so you can stop here. But do make sure that you've paused as we go along and defined any words you didn't know. You can look them up, okay? And study these notes so that you're ready for tomorrow in class. Thanks.